The forest held its breath as dawn struggled to find its way between the branches. Mist clung to the undergrowth, drifting in pale ribbons that blurred the edges of trees into ghostly shapes. Boots pressed against the frosted ground, steady but unhurried, their sound swallowed almost instantly by the hushed silence. A police patrol moved in formation, for men whose expressions were etched by long nights and unspoken thoughts. They had come out for routine, checking the woods for signs of poachers, but each carried private burdens heavier than the rifles on their shoulders. The sergeant walked in front, his jaw set, every movement betraying a man who had lived too long by rules and duty. Behind him followed a younger officer, barely past his 20s, eyes bright with the kind of empathy that hadn't yet been worn down. The other two kept pace, older and quieter, bound by habit rather than choice. They did not speak, but their silence was alive, filled with things they could never voice in the stillness of trees. It was the sound that broke them from routine, a low cry, half whinny and half scream, so unlike any bird or beast they knew, carried through the pines. The sergeant froze. The younger officer lifted his head, listening again, heart already beating faster. A second cry followed, ragged and full of desperation. Without speaking, they moved, the sound guiding them deeper into the forest's hush. The clearing revealed itself suddenly, a pocket of pale light where the canopy had thinned. There, tangled among the broken branches of a fallen tree, lay a wild Mustang. Its gray coat was smeared with mud and streaked with blood, where sharp wood had bitten into its flesh. Breath came hard from its flared nostrils, each exhale clouding the morning air in bursts of steam. Its eyes rolled wide and white, wild with terror, catching the men in their desperate shine. The officers stopped at the edge of the clearing. The Mustang thrashed once, a violent surge that rattled branches and snapped one free, before collapsing again, chest heaving. The sound of its struggle filled the space like thunder. No one moved at first. The sergeant's gaze hardened, calculating danger. One man muttered that they should leave it, let nature take its course. Another shifted uneasily, staring at the animal with pity that gnawed at him. It was the youngest who stepped forward, almost without thought. His boots sank into wet earth as he crossed the invisible line between hesitation and choice. He had never stood so close to such power undone, a creature built for freedom brought low by a twist of fate. The horse's gaze locked onto his, wild fear softening into something less certain. For a heartbeat, the clearing stilled, only the drip of rain from branches above breaking the silence. The sergeant hissed his name, warning sharp in his tone, but the young man did not retreat. He knelt slightly, lowering himself as though to show he carried no threat. His hand hovered, not reaching yet, but close enough that the Mustang's breath brushed against his skin. The animal shivered, trembling beneath its weight, but did not strike. Around them, the others exchanged glances, unease tugging at the edges of their restraint. They had come prepared for men with rifles, not a wounded symbol of the wild staring back at them. The forest seemed to lean in, every pine needle holding its silence, every shadow drawn to this fragile bridge forming between man and beast. The young officer whispered something, words too soft for the others to catch, meant only for the creature before him. The Mustang's ear twitched, eyes narrowing, and for the first time its thrashing stilled. A fragile thread of trust hung there, as fine as spider silk, yet strong enough to pull every man in the clearing into its spell. No one dared to breathe too loud. Rain began to fall in thin lines through the canopy, each drop striking leaves like a muted drum. The world outside the clearing felt distant, unimportant. What mattered was the horse's trembling chest, the dirt beneath their knees, and the silent agreement beginning to form between them. When the Mustang's eyes steadied, the sergeant's face shifted, though his voice never came. The moment closed with a single truth. They could not walk away. And yet, the path forward was anything but clear. Lantern light flickered against the wet bark of trees, casting long shadows across the clearing where the Mustang lay pinned. The patrol had not left. Their rifles leaned and used against a trunk, forgotten in the urgency of something larger than orders. Rain whispered through the canopy, soaking coats and dripping from brims, yet none of them moved away. Duty had led them here, but now something quieter held them fast. A shared understanding that what they had found demanded more than protocol. The sergeant paced at the edge of the light, boots squelching in the mud. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he pulled a cigarette he never lit. He stared at the animal as though weighing the cost of every decision, as if saving it might be a betrayal of the hard world that had shaped him. The older officers crouched near the fallen branches, their breaths puffing in pale clouds as they studied the tangles trapping the Mustang. They had seen wounds and wreckage before, but never a creature whose strength still glimmered beneath such ruin. The youngest officer remained closest. He had not moved far since kneeling. The horse's breaths brushed his sleeve, each one ragged but alive, each one a reminder of fragility pressed against power. He spoke softly, more to soothe himself than the animal, words tumbling like prayers whispered into the night. The Mustang's ears flicked, its muscles quivering, but it did not strike. That small mercy emboldened him. "We can cut it loose," one man murmured, voice low but urgent. He gestured toward the knife at his belt. Another shook his head, pointing out the danger. One thrash of hooves could crush bone. They argued in hushed tones, the rhythm of their debate weaving around the steady pant of the horse. Each reason for retreat clashed with something unspoken in their faces. The memory of helplessness, the yearning to defy it here. At last the sergeant stepped forward, his voice rough. "We try once. If it lashes out, we walk." His words carried the weight of command, but beneath them lingered something softer, permission to hope. The men nodded, relief hidden in their silence. They began with care. One officer pulled his coat from his shoulders and draped it gently over the Mustang's eyes. The horse tensed, a shudder running the length of its body, but then stilled as darkness dulled its panic. Another officer knelt, knife flashing briefly in the lantern glow as he slid the blade against thick branches. Splinters snapped, falling into mud. The youngest whispered steady encouragement, his voice a tether that kept the animal from breaking free into terror. Progress was slow, each movement deliberate. A branch gave way, freeing part of a foreleg. The Mustang kicked once, narrowly missing the sergeant's boot. He did not curse or retreat, only pressed his weight against the trunk, jaw clenched, until the horse calmed again. The effort demanded more than strength. It demanded patience, humility, the willingness to bend before the wild. As minutes stretched, the clearing changed. No longer just men and a beast, but a circle bound together by fragile trust. The youngest officer thought of his father, gone too soon, and how this act felt like defiance of every loss that had marked him. One of the older men recalled silently the foal he had once seen drown in river mud. Each carried their ghosts, and in cutting branches, they were cutting away pieces of themselves long buried. When the last limb trapping the Mustang's flank snapped free, the horse lurched, nearly toppling them. Mud sprayed, lantern light trembled, but the coat over its eyes held, and their hands steadied. The creature sank back to its knees, exhausted but unbroken, its chest rising in heavy rhythm. They sat back, gasping, faces streaked with rain and sweat. The sergeant's cigarette lay crushed in the mud, forgotten. He looked at the animal, then at his men, and though no words passed his lips, the truth settled in all their hearts. They could not leave it here. The rain slowed, the fire of their lanterns still steady, and with it came a new weight. Not whether to save the Mustang, but how to carry through the promise they had already made. "You said." Night pressed down heavy, a velvet dark pierced only by the glow of a single lantern set on a rock. The clearing had grown hushed after the struggle, the forest seeming to honor the fragile truce between men and beast. Smoke curled upward from a small fire they had coaxed from damp branches. Its warmth meager, but enough to hold them close. Around it, the police party sat in silence, boots muddy, coats dripping, eyes fixed on the Mustang resting a few feet away. The animal lay on its side, ribs rising and falling with a steady rhythm. No longer frantic, but worn thin by exhaustion. The coat still draped over its eyes gave it a strange dignity, as if it were a soldier in bandages, too weary to protest. The youngest officer crouched nearest, knees drawn to his chest. His lips moved occasionally, murmuring words only the horse could hear. Perhaps nonsense, perhaps prayer, but each syllable softened the night. The older officers busied themselves with ritual gestures of their own. One polished the buckle of his belt until it gleamed in the lantern's light. Another unfolded a slip of paper, creased and faintly stained. A letter from home, words he knew by heart, yet read again with the reverence of Scripture. The sergeant, though he said nothing, fingered the rosary beads tucked into his palm. None of them admitted fear, yet each clung to some small anchor that kept the weight of the forest from swallowing them whole. The Mustang shifted suddenly, groaning deep in its throat. Hooves scraped mud as it tried to rise, legs trembling with effort. Instinctively, the men moved as one, not away but closer, ropes in hand to steady without binding. The animal staggered, half risen, then collapsed again in a spray of earth. The youngest pressed his hand firm against the heaving neck, whispering reassurance. For a tense heartbeat, they thought the horse might lash out, but instead it stilled, sides quivering, breath ragged but alive. They remained there, gathered around like sentinels at a vigil. The forest was not kind to intruders, yet tonight it seemed to yield. The rain eased to a mist, dripping softly from the high branches. Somewhere distant, an owl called, its sound mournful but steady. The fire crackled low, throwing thin shadows that stretched across mud and muscle alike. The men spoke only in fragments, voices hushed as though afraid of breaking a spell. One mentioned his daughter's laugh, how he had not heard it in months. Another recalled the horse he had once ridden as a boy, sold when times grew lean. Their stories brushed against one another like threads weaving a quiet tapestry. None of it was shared for sympathy, only because silence itself had grown too sharp. The sergeant finally spoke, his voice low, gravelly. "It trusts us more than it should." He stared into the fire, eyes reflecting the glow. "But that means we owe it more than leaving it here." The words landed heavy, binding them more surely than any command. No one argued. The truth was already carved into their hearts. Hours passed with a rhythm of breathing, both human and beast. The youngest officer dozed lightly, his hands still resting against the Mustang's damp hide. When the fire sputtered low, one of the older men fed it with another branch, the small flame flaring as though refusing to surrender. At last, the sky began to pale at the edges, a promise of dawn threading through the black. The forest lightened with it, mist turning from silver to gold. The Mustang stirred again, this time less with panic than with weary determination. Its ears twitched beneath the coat, muscles tightening as if testing strength that had nearly slipped away. The men watched in silence, their faces drawn but steadier than the night before. None reached for rifles, none moved to retreat. They knew what awaited them in the hours ahead. The Mustang would not rise alone, and neither would they. Morning unfurled gently, light spilling through the lattice of branches and painting the mist in strokes of gold. The forest that had loomed heavy and forbidding now seemed hushed with anticipation, as if it too waited for the moment to come. The men stirred stiffly from where they had kept watch, shoulders sore, boots caked in mud, eyes hollow with fatigue yet sharpened by purpose. Their rifles still leaned unused against the tree, forgotten guardians of a world that had shrunk to one fragile life before them. The Mustang shifted beneath the weight of its own body, muscles trembling as it drew in deep, determined breaths. The coat still veiled its eyes, but the animal's restlessness carried new strength. The youngest officer rose to his knees, brushing damp hair from his brow, and whispered again as he had through the night. A steady stream of words that calmed more than commanded. One of the older men crouched near the tangle of the final branches, still binding a hind leg. His knife gleamed in the newborn light as he prepared to cut. The sergeant knelt beside him, his hand pressing firm against the branch, steadying it. His voice, low but certain, carried to them all. "This is it. Once he's free, he chooses." No one argued. They knew the risk, that one violent surge could break bones, could scatter them. But none wavered. Their silence was its own vow. The blade bit into wood, fibers splintering with a muted crack. The Mustang jerked, chest heaving, hooves scraping the mud, but the coat softened its panic. The youngest officer pressed both hands against the trembling neck, murmuring with urgency now, voice cracking under the strain of hope. Another snap, another break, and then the last branch gave way. For a moment, nothing happened. The forest seemed to hold its breath, mist curling like smoke around them. Then the Mustang heaved itself upright in a violent surge, legs shaking, mud flying as it staggered into the light. The coat slipped from its head, falling into the muck. Its eyes flashed open, wild, unbound, glistening with something beyond fear. The men did not move. They stood rooted in place, hearts racing as they watched the creature sway, its chest rising and falling in thunderous rhythm. The horse limped a step, then another, each movement fragile yet defiant. When it reached the edge of the clearing, it paused, head lifting high, nostrils flaring as though drinking in the world it had nearly lost. Then, slowly, it turned its gaze back. The look was not long, but it was enough. In those dark eyes burned recognition, of struggle shared, of a night survived together. It was not gratitude in the human sense, nor forgiveness, but a bridge of understanding that bound them in silence. The youngest officer felt it like a weight in his chest, his breath catching as the animal lingered on him a moment longer before turning away. The Mustang vanished into the trees, its hoofbeats fading until they were indistinguishable from the forest's pulse. The clearing seemed emptier for its absence, yet fuller with what it had left behind. The men stood still, each carrying the echo of that final glance. The sergeant picked up his rosary, fingers tracing the beads with unusual care. One of the older men folded his letter again, tucking it into his pocket as though sealing away something sacred. The youngest officer stooped to lift the discarded coat, holding it in his hands like a relic. None spoke, for words could not reach the quiet that had settled among them. When they finally gathered their things, the rifles felt heavier, the forest lighter. They had come as enforcers of order, but they left as witnesses to something greater. How even in ruin, life could rise, and how saving another could bind strangers into brothers. As they walked back through the thinning mist, their boots pressing into the soft earth, the youngest officer glanced once more over his shoulder. The clearing lay still, empty now, yet alive in memory. And in that silence, carried by the rhythm of his steps, he felt certain of one truth. They had freed more than a horse that morning. They had freed themselves.